Okay, let's hope this is a bit better behaved. Now we were going to talk about phonetics. Phonetics deals with what we can measure. We can't measure phonemes or phrases or words. They're not obvious in the speech signal. It's a lot of work to recover them. Of course, when we listen to speech, we pick out words. But doing that automatically is very, very difficult. Phonetics deals then with the production, transmission, and perception of speech. Notice that phonology is a great deal removed from this level. So if you're working with the speech signal, it's a messy parallel channel in which linguistic and non-linguistic information are completely combined, not clearly separable. It's a theoretical decision that there must be something there which is separable, and we've just seen some reason for it. I mean, your intuitions about the plural marker and the regularity in the production of you between here and New York, for example, we're not making this up, right? So that is considered to be evidence for some kind of a system that one can study in its own rights. But with phonetics, we are resolutely in the physical world dealing with meat and spit and such, and the relationship to writing is, of course, gone. Now, there is a hybrid discipline called laboratory phonology that looks at the relations between phonetics and phonology. But when you're in the world of phonetics, this is what you're dealing with. This is a slide I did this morning. It's a waveform of someone speaking, so this is the vibration in the air. This is what a microphone picks up. And we can analyze that down below. We've broken it down by various frequency. We're following the pitch contours. We're following the amplitude contours. This is the domain of the phonetician. So where phonology deals with these idealized symbolic units, which can be combined according to formal rules, but represent a great deal of abstraction away from the physical signal. Phonetics deals with the physically instantiated system. Both try to understand how language is made manifest in speech, but phonetics is not necessarily committed to one theoretical view of what language is, whereas phonology starts with an assumption that language is one thing or another. So the way that you interpret the word language is going to matter here. And that's a really important part of this whole thing, is to make you aware that we don't know what language is, and if someone says language is X, Y, or Z, look at that as a hypothesis, not as something that's very, very clear. We'll see some good reason for caution here. So that concludes our brief rundown of these central disciplines for late 20th century linguistics, where we looked at semantics, syntax, morphology, and phonology together as a bunch. And we've dropped back out just as we came in with the study of meaning, but meaning as it related to human concerns, bound to specific contexts. That was pragmatics. So we emerged back in what is undeniably the real physical measurable world, in which individual productions are intimately related to context and don't necessarily admit of abstract intellectual formal treatment as symbols. So lots more to say about language. It's the richest of domains, and one of the more interesting questions is what's it there for? Now, if I ask you, okay, I'm going to ask you, what's language there for? What's the point of language?
To be able to communicate with each other.
Communicate is good. Yeah, that's one. What's the other one?
Self-expression.
Self-expression, yeah. Yeah, I see where you're coming from. That puts it in with grooming and clothes and lots of other things. Doesn't really narrow it down. There's one important one missing. If you were kept in solitary confinement 24 hours a day, or you're Robinson Crusoe living on an island before you find Man Friday, is there any language there?
Is it to fuel the development of, or the kind of discovery of everything else? So I don't know. I kind of think, when people first made fire, they had to communicate somehow how they did it and what it meant. And once they got fire, then it led on to something else, and it was through language they were able to develop and be inquisitive and to be able to produce more. Is it for?
So language clearly enables. I mean, this business of communication which we'll ask questions about what we mean by communication. It's not always clear what we mean by communication. That's undoubtedly very, very important. But there is another more inward-facing use, which is as thought. Now, we have to be very careful here, because the word thought is, like many of the central terms in cognitive science, not well defined, possibly not well definable. This may be just something we have to live with, but we are never going to arrive at the kind of agreement that's possible as we plot the course of the planets in the night sky. For example, astronomers can agree where a planet appears in the sky, at what time it appears. They use space and time to come up with a determinate observation. And there may be lots they don't know about the planet, but they sure as hell know how to know what that is. They know how to measure them. Thoughts and thinking generally is, we don't have an agreed account of what we're talking about there, which is a real problem. And perhaps these are not distinct, or not as distinct as one might think of them. So, do we agree that we have language like thoughts, that you might speak to yourself, as it were, or reason something through in language? You might hear your inner voice going, probably shouldn't go there, or something like that. Is that plausible? I have to ask you, because I don't know what it's like to be you. Well, Vygotsky, who we'll meet in the next section on development, is a Russian developmental psychologist, made a very important observation that young kids, when they're learning language, seem to initially think out loud. That is, the words, the process of language acquisition becomes this process of learning how to use language, and they have to then learn something else, which is learning how to use language silently. You slap little Jimmy on the head inside the church and say, Jimmy, use your inside voice. Well, that inside voice has to be learned, and it's a process of inhibition. So just inhibiting the manifestation in sound. And in fact, there's neurophysiological evidence that at least when you think coherently and clearly of a word, that you are subliminally activating the muscles and so on that will be required to actually speak that word. Likewise, when you hear something, when you hear words going on, there may be a direct link to your own processes of production, a kind of a resonant link there. The evidence here is difficult to interpret, and it's very slight, but it certainly seems plausible that where we might say there's two main reasons for language, communication and thought, that these might be continuous one another. When we deal with thinking, we're dealing once more with this problematic act that we always find ourselves doing, which is reification. That is, making a thing out of something which may or may not be a thing. So when we speak of cognition, when we speak of thought, when we speak of language, in each case, what we're doing is we're taking a leap into the dark by assuming that there is something that we could ring fence and describe coherently, with a little bit more precision than just stuff. And thinking is extremely difficult in this respect. It's a really problematic word. And if anyone speaks with confidence of what's going on when they think or when someone else thinks, you might want to just withhold complete assent. Not deny or accept, but withhold until it's clear in what sense this word is being used. Certainly, introspective consideration of that inner voice that most of us do seem to know something of suggests that it's not always speaking in clearly enunciated internal sentences that are well formed and so on. So even Vygotsky noted this, that as you think to yourself, you take a lot of shortcuts. I mean, if you're communicating with yourself, hopefully you've got some real strong basis for communication here. So there's shortcuts. It seems to be idiosyncratic, compressed, fragmented, but it's very difficult to know. So this hypothetical role of language in thinking was what Jerry Fodor, in his language of thought hypothesis, called mentalese. You can think of that as being like Chinese, but for mental stuff. It's the language of thought. You put it very well. And certainly in the 1960s, 1970s, and well into the 1980s, I hope it's not still going on quite like this today, but the main battlefield in cognitive science was the debate as to what thought is and whether all thought is language-like, some thought is language-like, what role image-like properties play. So we'll meet the debate about mental imagery later on. This has been fought over by cognitive psychologists and linguists and developmental psychologists of all kinds of stripes. It certainly is not the kind of battle that ends up at one side being a victor. One doesn't come out and discover in 1990, yes, all language is actually, all thought is actually language-like, or all thought is picture-like, or something like that. But it has been a battlefield in which many competing approaches to development, to interiority, to mind-body issues, to mind generally have found expression in the 20th century. One of the strongest arguments for the role of language is that as a competent language user, it's very easy to construct sentences which together enunciate thoughts that it seems impossible to have without the structuring, scaffolding properties of language. So my example there, if three of us sneak in the back, we can steal at least a bag of apples without getting caught. If you think about this, this contains all kinds of language-enabled features, such as thinking about something which is not actually there. We're projecting forward into a hypothetical future. It's not clear that any non-linguistic being can do that, can reason about something that's not physically present. Even the famous chimpanzees of Hoover, who solved lots of problems by you hang fruit up out of the way and they stack up some crates in order to get it. Everything has to be in the field of view. Everything has to be present at one moment for that kind of reasoning in chimpanzees to work. But as a language user, we all the time are reasoning about hypotheticals, counterfactuals, past, present, and future. Includes such indeterminate notions as at least. And there's several kinds of counterfactuals here, because if you can have this thought, you can have the same thought where you do get caught stealing the apples as well, also happening in some hypothetical future. So the relationship of the content of this thought to reality is made possible by language in ways that are clearly very complex. And it seems like there's a very strong case to be made that language enables you to think, reason, and problem solve in ways that would not be possible otherwise, because there's many properties here. Some of them are structural properties, because you can look at the way that these complex parts are put together in a sequence here. We've got a conditional, and we've got some action going on. Lots of qualification. So the least qualifying a bag of apples, at least a bag of apples brings to mind a bag of apples and possibly more apples. I don't think we need to belabor the point further. Language certainly has a role to play in something like thinking. I don't know if thinking is a well-defined object, but certainly if we want to understand language, we've got to understand stuff like this. So some immediate questions you might ask, if that is language and you just had a thought like that, did that thought have an accent? Did it have a voice? When you're reading, is there a voice in your head? Can you read in a Scottish accent? Are your thoughts always in the same voice? Do you have dueling thoughts in different voices? Introspection gets you into trouble here, but it opens up a whole new world. If you start to think of the language of thought as being continuous with spoken language, then lots of questions that you can ask about overt public language can be asked about inner language as well. And it's kind of odd. I mean, I presume you watched The Simpsons at least once in your life. You can imagine something spoken by groundskeeper Willie, right?
Yeah.
These questions open up. We're not going to answer them. This is an introductory module, but there's fun to be had there. Andy Clark has provided a very interesting account of how language enables thought. And in his 2008 book, Supersizing the Mind, contains the following example, which is very, very interesting in that it suggests that even something as pre-linguistic as learning to use labels can greatly affect your ability to deal with the world. So in this particular example, there's two chimpanzees Sheba and what's the other one? Sarah. Now, Sheba is trained in numeral use, so she knows what the symbols 0, 1. Well, I don't know about 0, but 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9 mean. She knows to associate those with quantities. She's a competent number symbol user, at least for up to 9. And so they play this rather mean game. The two chimpanzees are together, and the trainer regularly brings out 2 plates which have different amounts of treats on them. And Sheba points to one of the plates, and that plate goes to her colleague, Sarah. This is the game. And if you do this with naked, unadorned treats, she always points to the plate with more, even though she understands the game, and gets frustrated when they go to her friends, so she gets the plate with less. But if you do exactly the same thing, but you cover them over and put symbols on the outside that say how many treats there are, now she can solve the problem, and she can go for the one, she can point to the one with less, so that goes to her colleague, and she gets the one with more. It's a very interesting demonstration. What it means is, well, what it looks like is that when no symbols are involved, the appetite of pull of the larger plate of treats is irresistible. She's just caught up in that. Any of you who've ever given up smoking might be aware of some of these difficulties of extricating yourself from that kind of appetite of flow. Whereas once there's symbols involved, there's some mediation between her and the treats, and allows her to project forward, reason about the thing, and create what is for her the desired outcome. Now, maybe we're wrong about the desired outcome here, but it seems fairly straightforward interpretation of what's going on. So even the use of labels can solve a problem. And I think, Jenny, your point about fire is well addressed here, that language is clearly a tool for solving problems. Now, we have seen in many species, especially chimpanzees and bonobos, we have seen the development of local technologies that are passed on from generation to generation within a group, and that are found within this group but not in some other geographically isolated group. That looks a lot like cultural transmission, but it's not obviously linguistic, and language does enable this kind of thing enormously. And of course, once you get writing, it's even possible to do this without face-to-face communication, which changes the game completely. So in this respect, the account given by Andy Clark is rather good and treats of language as a kind of a scaffolding. So it's a structure that is there that you can lean on and rely on. But what is thinking on this account? So we've clearly seen that if thinking is a difficult word and may or may not refer to something that's well formed, the language of thought hypothesis highlights or brings to the fore something that does need to be addressed. And the account that was developed then in the 1970s and 1980s by Jerry Fodor, working in close conjunction with Noam Chomsky, suggests that thinking or mental representations, mental processes, we just took a big leap there, going from the unspecified activity of thinking to the unspecified activity of mental processes, are computational processes defined over representations. This is the language of the computer metaphor of information theory of your mental life as computation. The computational theory of mind used to be the only game in town in cognitive science. It is not the only game in town anymore, but we need to understand what it is. It traffics in representations. Representations are things that's patterns of some sort that stand for something which is not present. So if I say hippopotamus, and there is no hippopotamus present, and you nonetheless intuit something of my meaning about a large 4-footed mammal found in West Africa, then we've successfully managed to refer to something which is not present. So something acted as mediated that. When you view the activity of thinking as the rule-based manipulation of symbols, which is the strongest form of this computational theory, then these symbols stand for things that are not present by virtue of the way that they fit into an ecosystem of symbols, like a language. we live in many ecosystems of symbols. Many of the signs out there, if you see a P surrounded by a red circle with a line through it, you know what to do. It's not straightforward in English, but this is part of a different ecosystem of symbols. There are many ecosystems of symbols, exit signs, for example. Give you a good example. The thought was here that one could characterize thinking as if it was the manipulation of symbols similar to what goes on in a computer program. This has led to some rather bizarre extrapolations, such as the idea that you might upload your mind to a computer. That's not going to happen anytime soon, folks. This is a theoretical move that does not lend itself to pinning down personal identity. It does open up lots of questions. I said thinking is a notoriously ill-defined word. So I don't have answers to these questions, but we can ask to what extent thoughts have anything to do with words. Are thoughts individuated even? Is there a process that we can call thinking, and if so, what's its connection to words? What do words facilitate? What kind of activity goes on that would not be possible without words? And we're going to always come back to this rather important question. We don't know what the subject of cognitive science is. We don't know what we're talking about. When we use something like mental life, and we say mental life is or is not thought, or mental life is 60% thought, all we've done is substitute one poorly defined word for another poorly defined word. Nevertheless, whatever is behind all this is impelling us. There's a reason that you chose to do this degree. There's a reason that lots and lots of people ask questions like this. We're short on answers. Given that we had to take a break because of the break in recording, is it okay if we just power on through for a little bit? You guys okay? If you want to take a break, let me know. So here's an interesting question. How did language evolve? Theory of evolution came around in the middle of the 19th century. And language seems to be the thing, well, it's one of the candidates for the thing that separates man from the brute beast. Now, can we just hold off a little bit before we even begin to try and answer this, and ask why we might want to differentiate ourselves from the brute beast? You missed lots of the introduction section to history. And in that, I was at great pains to point out that the context in which a science of psychology arose had the indelible stamp of the Enlightenment and Christian theology on it, in which an awful lot of theological notions that had served for millennia to single out humans as special, as God's distinct from the rest of creation, became integrated into our science, and that constitutes something of a problem. We need to make ourselves be rather self-aware when we're talking about souls. So souls became minds, and if we're now talking about cognitive systems, we want to sort of look back and develop an awareness for what happened there. So should we be trying to distinguish ourselves from animals altogether? Well, one of the questions you can ask is language, does language single us out? And if so, what does it mean to single us out? I mean, giraffes have really, really long necks. Does that single them out from the rest of creation because they have really, really long necks? Only spiders spin webs, as far as well, maybe someone else out there, I don't know. Spiders are really good at spinning webs. Maybe spiders look at a few other creatures that do a little bit of web spinning, and they look at them as we look at a chimpanzee trying to learn language, and we go, that's nearly there, but it's never going to get there. We're just brilliant. So we're brilliant at language. There's no doubt about it, and it is a characteristic of our species. And it's a characteristic that we really want to understand. And when we take an evolutionary perspective, it happened in a very short period of time. We need to develop a story of what we want to explain here, which of our behaviors we want to account for, which of them we think characterize us as a species distinct from other species, and then what the import of that is. Now, a big problem with the evolutionary story here, which would hopefully serve to tie our discussion of language in with the larger notion of biology, is that language use doesn't leave fossils directly. We are inferring the existence of language from evidence of symbolic organization to thought when we look at cultural products like musical instruments, funerary rites, cave paintings, such like these provide us with tantalizing hints that we might be dealing with ancestors who had language, but speaking alone itself doesn't leave direct traces. We might infer that because of the utility of language in things like dealing with fire, that where we look back in the archaeological record and we see the sudden burst of kinds of technologies, hunting technologies, for example, or settlement technologies or agriculture, we might conclude that, well, these ancestors must have had language because they couldn't have done those things. But we know that, for example, the use of fire is probably a lot older. We think Neanderthals had fire, but we don't know what language Neanderthals might have had. It's very, very difficult to study. And if you regard language as constituting your mental life, that's a huge... It's one thing to say that we have a species here that has some kind of behavior that produces results. You know, we learn to spin webs. We learn to do the speaking that's very important for developing technologies. It's another to say that your mental life is linguistic, because if we are the only species that has language, then we're the only species that has a mental life. This will have ethical consequences for how we stand, how we consider our stance with respect to other species. When you look at the story of evolution, when we look at the evolution of fins, of wings, of beaks, of digestive systems, of nervous systems, we're usually talking very, very long periods. And we're talking about understanding the relationship between a given species and its environment. It's only 5 or 6 million years at the longest between the last common ancestor of the human and the chimp. Something happened in that time that transformed our species. There's no doubt that the development of language transformed our species, enabled lots of things like culture and technology and so on. And we've gone nuts. We've taken over the whole world and we're about to destroy it. It's really had knock-on effects. There's no denying that. But what the hell happened? So it's not the case that our brains got massively reorganized. If you compare an ape brain with a human brain, they're almost exactly the same. There's not a single cell type in the difference. There are differences in the relative sizes of areas, and that's about it. We don't have any organ for language. Every single part of the body that's used in language and speaking is a whole body activity. Every single part is independently motivated. So language is this sort of parasitic system that sits on top of established structures. Even the complicated business here in the voice box is actually independently motivated and exists in non-linguistic analogues. It's there to stop you swallowing, inhaling your food, basically. It's because you've got the trachea and the esophagus, and you've got this crossing of the pathways. It's very easy to choke to death. And so we have a mechanism for stopping that. All these have become co-opted in language.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
Do apes, because I know that in humans, I remember from my degree that we have a Wernicke's area and a Broca's area with production and understanding language. And I know that's quite artificial, but there's quite two distinct areas that light up when you understand a word and when you produce a word. Do apes have something similar? Obviously they can't.
Broca's area and Wernicke's area are names that have become associated with specific parts of the left hemisphere to do with speech production and speech perception, respectively. Broca's area is here in the frontal lobe on the side, and Wernicke's area is back here around the junction of the parietal cortex and the temporal cortex. They are ill-defined. Those are functional definitions which have become known from their respective describers, where they were describing people who had lesions in these areas who seem to have deficits in speech production or speech perception, respectively. But they don't pick out, there's no clear anatomical marks of these areas, and apes, of course, have the same structure to their brain. We can point to the analog of it. We can point to the analog on the right-hand side of the human brain as well. These areas you can never say this brain area subserves this function. This brain area is there for function X. These brain areas are crucially involved in fine manual manipulation as well as fine manipulation of the internal vocal organs. Broca's area is one I'm more familiar with. I think Wernicke's area is much more poorly defined. But in apes and in humans and in monkeys, these areas are crucially involved in sequencing non-periodic movements which have to be highly coordinated. And that is only really relevant for animals who have these dexterous hands, and it points to a commonality between our manual skills and our vocal skills. But an ape brain is structurally almost identical to a human brain. We could identify the same areas, and they're not speaking. So the neurophysiology has given us zero help here. In other words, zero help. In 1866, the French Academy of Science banned theories about the evolution of language. They were outlawed from the scientific discourse. Now, the French like to do this. They like King Canute stopping the waves coming in. They also like to legislate about language use and say, "Thou shalt not use any English words like le weekend," and you just can't stop that kind of thing. So scientists, of course, haven't stopped thinking about the evolution of language just because the French Academy of Science banned it. The reason they banned it was that it seemed that there was no empirical evidence. There was no principled way that one could sort out these, and there was tons of fanciful speculation, none of which could be falsified. So they thought that was a bad way to do science. But I think we can do more than nothing here. So one thing we can ask is, what structures and abilities need to be in place for language to appear? There's been a lot of discussion, for example, about morphological differences in what we now call the vocal tract between humans and apes, and indeed between Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalis. Our voice box is very low and can be moved up and down quite spectacularly, actually, inside, and which enables us to have a great degree of vocal expression, vowel-like expression. We have very many vowel-like sounds, and that was it was hypothesized that that was necessary in order to enable linguistic communication. I don't think anyone actually believes that anymore, because you can get by. We have languages with no more than 3 vowel sounds, and a chimpanzee could theoretically make 3 vowel sounds, even though they don't have the lowered larynx, which gives us a great deal more flexibility. We mentioned that there's no part of the body there that seems to be there for the purposes of language, and that includes the brain. But we can ask. What we'll see is that because language has very many aspects, we might find signaling or communication systems in other species that don't add up to anything like human language, but are nevertheless interesting. So we'll see the bum wagging dance of the honeybee, for example, which contains encoded symbolic information. But it's not a generative, flexible, creative system. It encodes information about a specific thing, geographic directions and distances only. We have computational approaches to us now that the French Academy of Sciences couldn't have thought of. We can run computer simulations in which we have lots of agents which interact in simple ways, and we can set up the forms of interactions. We can dictate the rules, and we can introduce variation and look at simulated processes of evolution and development to look to see, can we find protocols that give rise to structure that resembles linguistic structure. There's a lot of interesting work done in Edinburgh, for example, in that way. We can devise behavioral games in which we have generations of people coming in solving simple tasks who are frustrated or not allowed to use normal language but are given some alternative means, and look to see, well, what kind of representations do they develop? And if we run this, if they then teach new learners who teach new learners who teach new learners, do we see the kinds of development that we know from the development of human languages? We have close observation fairly recently of almost de novo language development in sign language in Nicaraguan deaf children. There are also interesting, the relationship between sign languages and spoken languages is a very interesting one because things happen very fast there. We've also studied the development of novel languages from trading relationships, when you get, like, the British Empire hits China and they got to do trade, so they develop a thing called a Creole, which is a pidgin, first of all, which is a language that only supports trading and has very limited structural characteristics. And pigeons have grown up all around the world, but children reared in an environment in which there's a pigeon may come to speak the pigeon as a native language, and then it develops interesting complex features that are not found in pigeons. We call those Creoles. So Haitian Creole is an example of that arose out of a pigeon-like trading language. These are fully fledged natural languages. So we've seen things that the French Academy of Science couldn't dream about. But of course, the one thing that we've really made progress in is genetics. We have a whole science of genetics in the meantime. So maybe genes are the answer. Could there be a genetic mutation that happens that gave rise to language? I'm not sure what that would even mean. I don't think anybody thinks this is a coherent story anymore. Genetics itself is a rapidly changing field. And we don't simply associate genes with skills anymore, or genes. We don't simply associate genes with anything anymore. Genes are no longer regarded as blueprints for development. Genes are not structural building plans for an adult organism. That's not what they are. But the genetic variation between us and the apes is also minimal, of course. But in the 70s and 80s, before the Human Genome Project, when genes were thought of as this information theory language really ran out of hand, genes were thought of as simple instructions for building a phenotype. Then there was a hope that there might be a gene that we could identify that was different between humans and apes that would be held responsible for language, which also assumes that language is one thing, right? We'll see language as very, very many things, but so nobody believes this. But we can give a slightly longer answer than simply no. There is one story that has been studied since I'm not sure, it's late 70s, early 80s. And it has to do with a family called the KE family who are identified in England, in London, I think. And over 3 generations, you could trace there was a specific kind of what was called developmental verbal dyspraxia, a specific kind of speech impediment, kind of a clumsy speech, which arose in some members of this family and not in other members of the family. And when you have a large family, you can trace things back over 3 generations. You can spot patterns of Mendelian inheritance, which allow you to say with some conviction that this is gene-based. And you can go in and identify the gene. And the gene in question has a name. Genes always have funny names. It's FOXP2. So this family does have a genetic disorder with a single gene, FOXP2. And when this first came out, it gave rise to some really terrible, off-the-cuff, if-only science reporting. The gene for language had been found. Because of the clarity of patterns of inheritance in genes, some scientists went far too far in claiming that they had established a link between this gene and language. Now, FOXP2 is found in all mammals, and it varies slightly from one species to the next, and there are indeed slight differences in FOXP2 between chimpanzees and humans, and FOXP2 has a mutation in this family. So much for the tabloid story of we found a gene for language. But on closer examination, this family has very, very many issues. It is not language specific. They have certain learning disorders that go with this. There are coordination difficulties that go with this. Lots of the language, aspects of the language are absolutely fine and are not touched by this. So what we have is something which is not specifically linguistic. And also the claims being made for this seem to abstract away from everything else that was known about FOXP2. So it's interesting, if you're going to have a look at something like this, to look at, well, what does FOXP2 do elsewhere? FOXP2 in all mammals influences the healthy co-development of brains and lungs. And there's pause for thought there. Brains and lungs have a very tight relationship. They live inside the same body. But if you are flying around, for example, your movements that will lead you to smack into a cliff face or to avoid it are going to be tied to your respiratory movements, which are tied to the movements of your bat wings, for example. Just to take a bat example, because it's as far from humans as it can get. Brains and lungs develop together. Respiration is coordinated with very many other things, including all kinds of physical activity, just getting around in the world, as well as biosignaling, vocal calls of alarm, or what have you. So it's not too surprising that a mutation on this gene might affect speech and language in some respects. But the initial results led to some terrible science that had to be immediately retracted. However, I recently found a lovely video of a member of the KE family who was very happy to talk about his stuff. I hope you can hear this. I'll turn the sound up loud.
Hello people, today I'm just going to talk about 5 things about me. 5 things about me. Let me think. Number 1. I have a rare speech disorder called FOXPH2. If you want to know more information about that, you can is go on that, go to Google on that K-E family. I'm famous in the medical history on that. Number 2, I have a learning disability, but I can learn how to sort good things out from that. Number 3, when I was born, I learned sign language. Patrick Gorman, then I changed to Macintyre, then I changed to British Sign Language. And from that, when I was young, I was non-verbal, so now I have achieved a lot in that.
I'll stop there, not because I think he's gorgeous. He's a wonderful character, and he has up little YouTube signing tutorial videos for sign language. So you can see that this mutation, when he speaks of his learning disorder, it's not independent of his speech disorder. So this is the same mutation on the FOXP2 gene. But as you can also see, he's incredibly linguistic. He's perfectly linguistic. He has a coordination disorder. That's the essence of dyspraxia is a inability to coordinate smoothly and fluently. But that one could infer from this that the mutation in FOXP2 gave rise to language is clearly nonsense. Okay, so there's not going to be a simple story in that line, but you should know about that because that's the one avenue that's been pursued, is this FOXP2 gene. There's another hypothesis which I find incredibly appealing at the moment, and it comes from Michael Tomasello, who's a primatologist who works in Leipzig with chimpanzees, and he made the observation that there is one known biological change that happened in the 5 or 6 million years since the last common ancestor of humans, chimps and bonobos. And that is not in the nervous system at all. It's on the surface. We developed the white of the eye. Apes have dark sclera. They have dark eyeballs, and so you don't get the strong contrast pattern that we have. We have a dark pupil surrounded by a coloured iris surrounded by white, which provides an incredibly strong signal of where someone is looking. And this makes your intentions or your interlocutor's intentions manifest in a way that is not available to the apes. It's a very small biological change, but the consequences of this change might be huge. Now, if we take the standard 20th century view that language is all about syntax, it seems hard to understand how this could produce such dramatic results. But if we look at vocal behavior as a means of interpersonal coordination, that's taking a less strong theoretical position on it and bringing into the fold many more aspects to language, then this looks like a fruitful avenue to pursue. Tomasello calls it the cooperative eye hypothesis, and I don't think he's even recognized the power of this suggestion. So we have to account for a big change in behavior, interpersonal behavior, over a very short period. We have one small change that we know genuinely did happen in the biology. And what it led to is that human infants are bathing in a sea of joint attention from day one. They are constantly in situations with their carers in which they and the carer are attending to the same thing. And they learn this very, very quickly. They learn quickly to check where the carers are looking. Then they learn to follow the gaze of the carer. And then they learn to direct the gaze of the carer. Before they're 18 months old, they are in Machiavellian style telling their carers where to look, directing the gaze all around. Now, if you and I attend to the same thing, we suddenly inhabit a kind of a shared world. We will interpret threats and opportunities in a shared way. We have, in a very strong sense, a shared perspective. And this seems to me to be far more important in underpinning a story of what language is and these very many manifest effects of language than pointing to technical details like recursion in syntax. The jury is still out on this, but I think this is an excellent place to look, and it's definitely a better place to look than genetics. Of course, we need lots more elements, but it seems to me that we might understand the biological saltation, this enormous jump, well by paying attention to joint attention and its role, rather than looking at any of the insights from classical linguistics. But I don't know. If you look at the apes in Planet of the Apes, they all have white sclera. Of course they do. It makes them look intelligent. And Tomasello has also demonstrated that apes will try to attend to where other apes are looking, but they do it based on head gaze, not based on eye gaze. And if you think how sensitive we are to eye gaze, it's really remarkable. Now, there are other communication systems in animals that might be relevant. So I mentioned the bee dance. I don't think my little video here works. But bees are an example of a particularly abstract form of communication. When a honeybee returns from the hive having found a new source of nectar, they do a little dance which involves turning in circles and wiggling their bum a whole lot. And this reliably encodes and transmits information about the direction and distance to the pollen source. Let's just see, do they wiggle their dance? No, my video has stopped working. Sorry about that. This dance has been decoded, we know about it, but it cannot communicate arbitrary information. It doesn't provide a basis for developing new insights, new forms of communication. There's been a lot of work on trying to teach apes language. Very misguided work initially tried them to vocalize, to speak. Much more progress has been made using various kinds of symbol systems, sign language, or touchscreen based interfaces have all been used. It's become abundantly clear that you're not going to get to human-like levels of language use in apes, despite some kinds of progress. Almost any aspect of human language that you individuate, pull out and treat as very, very special, you'll find in some animal communication system. We have, for example, arbitrary relationships between specific sounds and things that are not present. There's a kind of a warning call given by marmots, which is different if the threat comes from above than if the threat comes from below, for example, which is an arbitrary learned relationship. Similarly, in English, there's no necessary connection between the sound of a word and the thing that it refers to. So horse, cheval, and pferd are completely different sounds, but within the appropriate symbolic ecosystem, they manage to refer to the same thing. Displacement is rare in animal communication systems, that is, to do something face-to-face that manages to refer to something which is not present. But the honeybee dance does that, so we find that. Deception, lying is really, really interesting. Misleading, or even making assertions or statements that you don't stand for, that you stand in a complex relationship to. So if I say that I suspect that's such and such, or I hope that's such and such, I've modified my relation to the empirical content of the contained phrase. That's a very effective thing that's found in all languages, human languages, but is not known from any animal communication system. Although we do find examples of deliberate deception in chimpanzees. Not because they're evil little buggers, just because they're very clever. Right? So this ability to not only say something, but to simultaneously express your relationship to what it is that you're saying and to modulate that independently introduces a level of abstraction that we don't find in animal communication systems. And the big one that Chomsky pointed to is this generativity and creativeness. The fact that we have a finite set of elements. So you have a vocabulary which is more or less fixed. You have a small set of function words, things like prepositions, articles, the, of, for, in, but, and so on. And they're not going to change much in your life. You have a much larger set of nouns, verbs, and adjectives. And that will grow and change. And you learn new, like to tweet, for example, is a new verb that we've all learned. But it won't grow much. And based on these, we can create an infinity of sentences. We can even demonstrate it's an infinity. If you have a sentence S, I can make a longer sentence by putting I believe that and then saying exactly the same sentence. Or you told me that. Blah, 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 blah. So we can recursively, by this structural trick of recursion, we can make infinitely large sentences. By contrast, look at this transcript. This is a rather confusing transcript, but this is the first live internet-enabled interspecies chat with Coco the gorilla, a poor gorilla who has learned kind of sign language. So Dr. Patterson is her minder, trainer, who is interpreting the signs and doing this. This is a chat room from the 1990s sometime. So someone asks, what are the names of your kittens and dogs? And Coco signs the sign for foot. And Dr. Patterson says, foot isn't the name of your kitten. So then she's asked, Coco, what's the name of your cat? And she does the sign for no. And the doctor says, she just gave some vocalizations there, some soft puffing. Hello, my baby is also a Confederate who's dealing with the questions and says, I heard that soft puffing. And the doctor says, now she's shaking her head no. And then the question comes from the outside, do you like to chat with other people? And Coco signs fine nipple. And Dr. Patterson helpfully explains nipple rhymes with people. She doesn't sign people per se. She was doing a sound. How much wishful thinking is going on here? We all really would like to have interspecies chat. Those people who have claimed that they have identified strong, genuine language elements to interspecies communication have been subject to enormous approbation in many respects, but also they've been quizzed very, very strongly. If you want to demonstrate that you've taught your parrots 6 colors and you can use language to distinguish, to talk about colored things with your parrots, the tests you have to go through are unbelievable. This does not pass anything kind of remotely. In fact, the most successful example of interspecies language use is with a parrot. It's with a grey parrot called Alex, belonged to an ex-chemist called Irene Patterson. Alex died there a couple of years ago, but you could speak to Alex and say things like, go to the next room, bring back 3 green long things, and he would do that, and he'd come back and he would say, yeah, there's 3 green long things. So he had certain numbers, certain categories, and so on. And I've looked at the scrutiny that these things were subject to in order to be reported in the scientific literature. This is a non-starter. But we can be too skeptical as well. 2012 was a great year for animals talking back to humans. This beluga whale was already dead by the time the article came out in Current Biology. It was a beluga whale that had been kept in captivity all her life, but was found to be making sounds which were recorded and were, after many years of discussion, were univocally decided that these were the whale imitating humans. It's the whale equivalent of going blah 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 blah, or woof 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 woof. You know, if you make animal sounds to an animal, this is the animal sounds that's taking the piss out of us. Because the beluga whale's normal vocalization, they have a rich vocal communication challenge with a fundamental frequency about 2,000 hertz, which is very high pitched indeed. In order to make these sounds, they have to drop that down to about 200 hertz. So it's nothing like their normal sounds. But speaking as a phonetician, it's a brilliant caricature of what human speech sounds like. It sounds like this. That's a whale going to a human. Blah, 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 blah.
It sounded like Happy Birthday. It sounded like it was singing Happy Birthday.
Some properties I would point out is it has syllables. It has a declining F0 contour. It has phrases. The phrase lengths are all entirely appropriate. The breaking up into syllables is entirely appropriate, which gives you this intensity contour variation. And the fundamental frequency decline. These are all standard characteristics of spoken language. So it's got an awful lot right there, even if it's not speaking English. The same year, there was another paper for an entirely new form of vocalization which was found. There was an elephant, again a captive element of course, well trained, which was trained in Korean and knew some Korean symbols as single syllables which were used by its trainer to differentiate different tasks. and it was then able to generate these itself through a mechanism which this elephant figured out for itself. It involves taking its trunk and inserting its trunk into its own mouth, into the back of its throat, and blowing to generate, which were what turned out to be intelligible Korean syllables. And then we finally, just because animals talking is just so much fun, here's a famous talking seal from Boston, Hoover, who died in 1985. He was reputed to speak with a Boston accent. I'm not so convinced of this one yourself. But you know what a Boston accent is? Park the car and have a yard. He was in Boston Zoo, so people interpreted that as a Boston accent. I'm not going there. But so it's not only us looking at the animals, sometimes the animals are looking at us. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to finish up the language section here with a little bit of work, reference to my own work, which is, well, it's non-Cartesian. So that's Descartes over there with his cogito, and we've mentioned before this problematic construct of the mind, which is a straightforward development of the soul, which is seen as private, self-contained, inaccessible by any other, and speech and language then becomes the transfer of messages from one such domain to the other. Nearly all the theoretical work in linguistics is based on this problematic metaphysical picture. It's a useful picture for many, many purposes. I'm not denying that language can be used to transmit messages, but we have been treating language as if it were only used for that purpose, as if that was what language was. And also, if you look at modern linguistics, that's semantics, syntax, morphology, phonology, selection. With the possible exception of phonology, you're dealing with something which is almost entirely based on writing, not speech. Syntax makes no reference to the voice, makes no reference to the business of producing speech. Everything in that classical box deals with symbols which are abstracted well away from the channel of communication, which, to my mind, clearly belie the literate concerns of the scientists studying them. Even phonology has been argued, I think, quite convincingly, is possible only for literate scientists who think in terms of alphabetic writing systems. There are many aspects of what we know to be language use which are ignored or left behind in this, and that's some of those that I use. And in particular, I look at the role of the voice. Now, Saussure and the whole of the structural linguistics of the first half of the 20th century distinguished between langue and parole. Langue was this abstract system of categorical oppositions that one needed to identify if one wanted to do the business of structural linguistics. Saussure broke away, he abstracted deliberately away from what people actually do, from the act of speaking, which is parole, because it was really messy. And he wanted, in keeping with the scientific tenor of the times, he wanted to identify a strong set of categorical oppositions which could be treated systematically and ordered systematically. Remember that periodic table of the elements. He was well aware of the violence he was doing to the object of his study, that he was leaving an awful lot behind, and this troubled Saussure greatly. By the middle of the 20th century, when we get to generative linguistics, well, the 1960s, Noam Chomsky introduces an entirely parallel distinction between competence and performance. Competence, which he took to be the object of the study of the linguist, refers to an internalized set of rules which allow you to distinguish grammatical from non-grammatical utterances. And performance is the messy business of what people actually do, which Chomsky famously disregarded and to this day continues to disregard. I think this is absolutely shocking. I think this demonstrates a disregard for what is manifestly the object of your study, which needs to be called out. Neither of these distinguish between speech and writing. Now bear in mind that writing is only about 5,000 years old. Widespread literacy is only about 500 years old. So if we want to understand whatever it was that changed our species so dramatically, we won't get there if we look at what writing added to the situation. And writing did change our species very fundamentally, just as the internet is changing our species very fundamentally. we want to understand writing, we need to want to understand what it was that gave rise to modern humans. We need to look at the voice and not at syntax, is my claim. So there's the standard set of disciplines which pick out something which is considered to be language. But one can ask questions about that. One can interrogate that. We can ask, what did this leave out? It left out everything about the body. It left out the role of the eyes, for example, in speaking. The eyes are incredibly important in speaking. The eyes are they're as much a part of the speaking situation as the voice. When a telephone was invented, it wasn't clear that people could use it. You can learn to use the voice without the eyes, but until then, the eyes were always part of a communicative situation. Even on the phone, people gesture with their hands. Even blind people in conversation gesture. And these gestures are not all simple, like pointing gestures, deictic gestures, which are clearly referential, so this serves to direct your attention to a particular place. They do all kinds of things, and if you don't allow people to gesture, they're not as good at language use. They have difficulties retrieving words. Everybody gestures. We've mentioned the gaze. Even blinks get sucked into the structure of a conversation, believe it or not. When we speak, there's lots of stuff that's not words. All those and so on, which serve to scaffold and maintain a communicative situation in which there's a bond between a speaker and a listener. Signs of mutual involvement are left out. And in my own discipline, in phonetics, so I started learning my phonetics in the 1980s. And right around there was a massive change in the discipline. All phonetics work up till then had been seeking the ghosts of letters, as it were. It was looking to understand these abstract units called phonemes, which were presumed to be the important element in speech. More musical-like elements to speech, such as rhythm and melody and voice quality, were ignored completely. And around about the 1980s, they came to be studied, and then they took over the entire domain. Now nearly everybody studies these. This is practically all that's studied in the domain of phonetics anymore. The overarching term is prosody, but it has proven very, very difficult to shoehorn this into the kind of symbolic structural description. And when I'm speaking, you can maybe intuit something of that these elements, the rhythm of my speech and the melody, these are not going to easily admit of the kind of categorical, discrete, symbolic description that the oppositions that give us the consonants and vowels do. That sentence went into the ground completely, sorry. So
would that be things like tone?
Tone.
Is an emphasis?
Yes, an emphasis.
Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Everything that distinguishes a good speaker from a bad speaker, mellifluent speaker from a harsh speaker, effective speaker from an ineffective speaker. So all these are omitted. And there's something else that's omitted here, which is what I study. I study a thing called joint speech. And so omitted is it that I had to invent the term myself. There is no term of art for this. And it serves to link the kind of vocal behavior found in practices of prayer, of protest, of secular rites and rituals, as well as religious rites and rituals, all kinds of rituals, political activities, and even educational activities. Now, do either of you speak Laotian? Lao, the language, Lao? Not fluent in Lao? Right, well, here's some Lao children. What are they doing? Any guesses? Not the alphabet. Good guess.
Times tables?
Times tables. I've never had someone not get it. I've used this in many, many talks. So this is used around the world. Primary school teachers use joint speech in very, very many ways, very interesting ways. It's used in lots of really interesting situations. And there's so much to study here. This kind of speech is as old as humanity itself, as are rituals. So we have to be able to peer back before the advent of religion and political systems here in order to understand this kind of speech. Just as an example, the first chant you're going to hear has its origins where a place I was just visiting, Chile. I've just come back from Santiago. And they were, in the 1970s, Salvador Allende was elected there as democratic president of a left-wing government, and in September 73 he was assassinated as part of a right-wing coup inspired by the CIA. Part of his democratic campaign had been a protest statement, "The people united will never be defeated. El pueblo unido jamás será vencido." Spanish pronunciation is a little better after visiting Chile. And that became, as a result of that coup, that political activity became the hallmark of political protest around the world. Here it is in New York. Great, here it is in Dublin, it's dirty Dublin students. You get the pattern, right? Here it is, a couple of years ago I was attending a little riot in Brazil. You can tell neither of you speak Portuguese. It's extremely rude what they were just shouting. Doesn't matter.
I'm learning.
That's not in your books. And this has become the exact same pattern has become the template of the Arab Spring, where it's Ashab Yurid Isqat an Nizam, the people demand the fall of the regime. So you can follow it around. And you can find it in all kinds of really interesting situations. So for me, this use of New Year's Eve is really, really telling. People do this always on New Year's Eve. What are they doing? Well, what they're doing is they're being in the same place at the same time. They're marking a time as being of joint significance. Bear in mind that New Year's Eve itself is an entirely arbitrary construct. There is no physical definition of New Year's Eve. Midnight is an entirely arbitrary construct. So this has been used and integrated into rituals. Rituals are the first means by which we agreed on what time is, by which we marked transitions and recurrences, by which we grasped the fact that years recur and there are parts of a year, and also in life that we transit from one phase to the next. Initiation rites, weddings, for example. All these rituals involve synchronized gestures and speech. And yet, given all this, there's no science in the area, which I find bizarre. So having looked at this in some detail, glossolalia is the phenomenon of speaking in tongues, right? Known to Pentecostal worshippers, where the Holy Spirit comes down, and it's really interesting. And there's about 10,000 scientific papers on the topic. You can look at, is it ancient Aramaic? Answer, no. Does it lead to positive psychological effects? Is it associated with various psychological pathologies? There's all kinds of questions you can ask about this, and they have been asked. There's an order of magnitude less work on this entirely ubiquitous business of speaking together, joint speech. And the reasons for this are really kind of interesting. When we speak together with one voice, we've got something which doesn't fit the model of language that we were just talking about. Everybody's a speaker and a listener at the same time, so the whole business of message passing has gone out the door. Everybody knows the text. The texts are not being authored spontaneously. The texts are written by someone else and are perhaps being curated. They're integrated into structures like liturgies, but they can be quite complex in a political context as well. But they speak of common purpose, shared subjectivity, and another necessary feature of these is the repetition and repetition and repetition, where something's going on there that is not captured by a message passing description. I have lots of theories on it, but if we go back to Aristotle, in De Anima, Aristotle pointed out that where there's a voice, we obligatorily project a subject. A voice is a kind of an ensouled thing. If we speak of the sweet voice of a lyre, Aristotle said, we're using it in a metaphorical sense. Its home root is something with a soul. And there's a fascinating book on the history of ventriloquism by Stephen Connor in Cambridge, which follows voices coming from places voices shouldn't come from. Back from the Delphic Oracle, you can go all the way back to the Delphic Oracle, and you can trace the progression through the Middle Ages, where the voices coming from unwarranted places are always signs of possession, demonic possession, right up to the rather spooky genre of horror films based around ventriloquists. It's always, whenever a voice comes from somewhere it shouldn't, we never ask, how did the genitals or how did the corner of the room learn to speak? We ask who's in there. We project a subject onto it. That's why ventriloquism works. Right? So it seems that voices are associated with subjects, and the absence of any attention in the empirical literature to this joint speaking is because it requires acknowledgement of a joint subject, and we don't have a language for dealing with that, which, given the historical development of the language of psychology in a Christian theological context, with its emphasis on the autonomy and distinctness of the individual, is not surprising, but it is lacking. Something is missing there. Another interesting aspect to this particular kind of speech, another one way it opens doors, is that there's no distinction possible anymore between music and speech. Normally these are taken as completely different enterprises. Music is nice but irrelevant. Auditory cheesecake, as Steve Pinker called them once. Language is which is responsible for the development of our species. But when you focus your attention differently and you look at joint speech, what you find is a continuum. So in more solemn occasions, when we're swearing oaths or we're reciting a text just for instrumental purposes, it's completely non-musical. The prosody of the speech is entirely normal. But with the repetition, you get these elements of rhythmic emphasis coming in. Repetition itself induces melody. And then you move into this domain of chant, which in English is beautifully ambiguous between spoken and sung, because it applies to both domains. And as you add more music-like elements like polyphony and meter, then you move out of the domain of language and you move out of the domain of earnest commitment. So if you're swearing an oath, you don't sing that oath. You speak that oath and you enunciate it. If you mouth the words to a Bob Marley song on the dance floor, it doesn't mean you're committed to the tenets of Rastafarianism and you want Haile Selassie recognized as the incarnation of God. It's just mouthing words. So as the musical elements come in, participation becomes easier. So you get this beat. But the commitment required becomes less. Now there's a sweet spot in there in the middle where we recite things with one voice, and that's where we find the credo, the recitation of overt religious belief. It also applies to happy birthday, because the distinction between speech and music has gone by the board. So what we find is this for language use in different contexts, we find different kinds of negotiation. If you're on your own, like Descartes, speaking to yourself in your mind, there's only you around. When we get this kind of situation, we're co-creating. We are now co-creating this situation, but the speaking roles are asymmetrical. I'm doing nearly all the speaking. Later on, in a few minutes, we'll have a more democratic conversation where we do it together. But then we reach this. There's a sweet spot here where we say the same thing in chorus. And as we follow over into the domain of speech and music, we find the introduction of the beat, the introduction of the common time, and the facilitation of participation. Participating in reciting a creed is very difficult. Lapsed Catholics who go to Mass in Ireland hate joining in that prayer. They're happy to stand up and sit down when everyone else does it, but actually saying something implied, because when you speak something, you are responsible for what you speak, you utter. And this is the element that, to me, formal linguistics has lost completely. But I won't bore you with this. This goes all kinds of interesting places. The point I really wanted to make is that when we speak of something called language, as always in cognitive science, we're reifying, and we have to do that. We're reifying when we speak of cognition, when we speak of thinking. These are not words that have stable definitions. But I introduced this the last day as language and languaging, and while I don't like the word languaging, I think it's very useful because it highlights the fact that we're dealing with a variety of behaviors and practices that probably have different origins, that include an awful lot more than the transmission of symbolic messages through some medium or other, that involve the whole body, that are context-specific, that are collaborative, that involve both speakers and listeners collaboratively. And I think we would do well to pay a lot more attention to the role of the eyes in all this. So the whole point here is not to thrash linguistics, it's to open up and point out that there's a vast array of understudied forms of interpersonal coordination. And I think coordination might be a more useful word here than communication, because communication leads to this business of message transmission, which certainly is important, but doesn't exhaust the things we put our voice to. So